If we were reading the Republic as a whole and reading it for its own sake, we'd be very interested, I would say most interested, in the definition of justice that's given here, which, after all, this book centers on the question: what is justice, and whether we should be just or not. We're more or less. I mean, you can't read this anything from this book and not keep that in mind. But our focus here is Plato's theory of human nature, and Plato offers a theory of human nature in this book in support, given the Republic as a whole, of a certain argument, not for what justice is, but the question whether or not we should be just. But our concern is really with the theory of human nature given here. But that theory is connected up with a theory of justice. Remember last video, I saw that Socrates and his friends are looking into the city, and they're looking for where the four virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, or wisdom, valor, temperance, and justice, where they are exemplified in this perfect city or this state that they're talking about. And we saw that Socrates defined temperance in the city as as temperance is in the self, the better part of the self ruling over the worst part of the self. Really, the rest of the book 4, is really a matter of then looking for where justice is in the city, and then asking oneself maybe a question that should have been asked already by Socrates and his friends: whether the self, whether the individual really does have parts that are in relation to each other. The definition of justice in the city turns out to be, I don't know, rather ad hoc. Here on page 8, he says, and then on this view, also justice will be admitted to be the having and doing of what is a man's own and belongs to him. Sort of intuitive notion of justice is everybody having what they deserve or doing what is their own and not somebody else's. And then that is extended actually to the state, the city with its three classes. And Socrates says here, seeing then that there are three distinct classes, these social classes of gold, silver, and bronze, any meddling of one with another or the change of one into another is the greatest harm to the state, and may be most justly termed evil doing. And the greatest degree of evil doing to one city would be termed by you injustice. This then, Socrates says, is injustice. And on the other hand, when the traitor, the auxiliary, and the guardian each do their own business, that is justice and will make the city just. So justice in the city turns out to be when every part of the city, which basically means every class of the city, the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the moneymakers, otherwise known as the gold, silver, and bronze classes, when they each do their own business or each do what they're supposed to do, that's justice in the city. And, it's all kind of circular, but what they're supposed to do, these classes, is the gold are supposed to rule, the silver is supposed to carry out the orders of the rulers, and the bronze are supposed to obey. That's what they're supposed to do. And obviously there's a kind of a question-begging thing there, like what makes one class deserving of rule and another class merely to obey. But you can see that Socrates is setting up a notion not only of human nature, but the proper ordering of human nature. Because if we apply that notion of the three parts doing what they're supposed to do to the self, well, first they have to ask themselves whether the self has parts at all. And that's what this lengthy discussion is here about, is whether there are parts to the self, distinct aspects of a human individual self that reflect these different, that are a similar structure as the imaginary city that they've been making up. And then the question is, how should it be ordered? But the long and short of it is, Socrates argues that there are such parts to the self. There's the part that has desires, and there's the part that can say no to desires. The part that has the desires we'll call the desiring part. And the part that can say no, for instance, he says, that there's a part that is thirsty or is hungry. That is, we are thirsty or hungry. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we will eat or drink, that there's a part of us that can say no to desire. And that is the thinking part, the rational part, the calculating part. As he says here on page 13, and if you suppose something which pulls a thirsty soul away from drink, that must be different from the thirsty principle which draws him like a beast to drink. For as we were saying, the same thing cannot at the same time with the same part of itself act in contrary ways about the same. That is, if the human self were an absolute unity, an indivisible unity, then it would not be able to be pulled in two directions at once. And the reality that sometimes part of us really wants to drink or eat or do whatever we have a desire to do, but another part pulls in a different direction, says, no, don't drink that, no, don't eat that, or just no, don't do that, is in itself Socrates' proof that the human self is not an absolute unity, that it's complex, that we can say crudely that it has parts, but what we really mean is that there's different aspects to a human being, to human nature. There's a part that, like all animals, just has desires, but then there's a part that can say no. The forbidding principle, he calls it here in the top of page 14, and the forbidding principle is derived from reason, and that which bids and attracts proceeds from passion and disease. Then we may fairly assume that they are two. So there are at least two aspects to human nature, then, to the individual human self. There's the part with the principle derived from reason, and then there's the part that's pure desire. These two principles existing in the soul. If we consider the soul to be the entire living person, there's at least two aspects to that, the desires and reason. And then maybe just to make it all sort of match up with the three classes of the city, he talks about passion or spirit. And then the spirit, not in the sort of Christian sense of spirituality or the general religious sense, the spirit in the sense of having spirit, being a spirited person, a spirited horse or something, as a third part. And so what we end up with, we make this a little bigger, is something like this. On the basis of the original division between the gold rulers, the silver auxiliaries, and the bronze moneymakers, we get this notion of the human being having the same tripartite, three-part division within the self, that we have the rational part of the self. At the opposite end, we have the desires. And then in between, we have what Plato calls the spirited part. The spirited part is the principle of courage, especially physical courage. You know, if the rational part is the part of us that can think and reason, and the desires are simply our wants, the things that we crave, our urges, then the spirited part is something in the middle. It's the part of us that can get angry. But it is, as we see, a crucial mediator between these two parts. So one more video, just to sort of talk a little generally about the ramifications of this three-part theory of human nature.